afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's my distinct honor and pleasure to join you today to speak to you about some of the critical themes pertaining to my new book project on Black women and convict labor in the New South. The purpose of my lecture is to introduce you to the three main subject areas that I find to be most essential to this work. One being labor, two being violence, and three resistance. To kick off my discussion, I'd like to open with a narrative that in many ways captures the essence of this work. On the afternoon of October 24th, 1884, Ella Gamble sat stock still in the Hamilton County Courthouse while an all-white male jury deliberated her fate. The 22-year-old pregnant newlywed and domestic worker had been nearing the end of her first trimester when she was charged with the murder of Pink Buchanan, her employer. Gamble was accused of poisoning the man by putting rough on rats, a popular form of rodenticide, in a tub of milk consumed by the deceased. Although the evidence against her was circumstantial, it took the panel nearly 2 hours to return a verdict of, quote, guilty with recommendation to imprisonment for life. 20 years later, Gamble was granted executive clemency. From the point of her incarceration in 1884 until the date of her release, she was a productive asset to Georgia's penitentiary system. Under the sting of the lash, she superintended the cook squad at the B.G. Lockett Brickyard, hauled slabs at the Chattahoochee Brick Plant, stitched brooms at the Bolton Broom Factory, and tilled the fields of Camp Herdmont and the State Prison Farm. Albeit by force, Gamble established a laboring repertoire that was elastic and complex, embodying the sinuous nature of convict leasing in the New South's industrial capital. After experiencing 2 long decades of labor, Gamble's body was left, quote, in terrible condition, liable to die at any time from sudden hemorrhage. Her womb, bladder, and rectum had been eaten away by cancer, making her unprofitable for future use. She was declared by authorities as simply, quote, a woman now in poor health on account of the heavy work she has been compelled to do since her confinement in the penitentiary. Yet the full historical record contradicts this uneven rendering of Gamble's circumstances. Certainly, heavy work was the principal contributor in the deterioration of her physical state. However, merciless floggings, sexual abuse, injurious childbirths, and medical neglect all contributed to laying waste her health. Ella Gamble's case spotlights the quintessential features of imprisoned Black women's lives and laboring experiences in post-Civil War Georgia and throughout the South, and animates the suffering many female felons endured within the state's private lease camps. Her example also shows the intractable optimism some women possessed, even in the face of death. As Gamble's melanoma-ravaged body was being handed over to the custody of her brother, the petitioner in her case delicately, quote, explained to her the possibility of her trip causing her death by hemorrhage. The dying woman insisted that she, quote, wanted to be sent home with her brother so that she could find a cure. Off the grid, tucked away in flying railroad camps, brickyards, chain gangs, lumber mills, mines, plantations, stockades, kitchens, wash houses, barns, and big houses, African American women prisoners lived, labored, suffered, and died. Yet their lives are nearly impossible to trace in writing from the post-Civil War era, and they still remain largely outside the historical literature's field of reference due to their limited numbers and/or overarching perceptions about their reduced profitability when compared with Black men, or from limitations wrought by the scarcity of historical evidence. Nowhere is this absence more deeply felt than in the masculinist realm of convict labor studies, where a woman's worth is least regarded. It is within this historiographical space of convict labor studies that women prisoners' contribution to the forging of New South modernity has tended to be measured in terms of productivity and profit alone. While my study has shown that Black female convicts did in fact supply a rich source of labor and profit to Southern industrialists, there are other considerations to be made in our assessment of a woman's worth to the postbellum carceral state. From an institutional perspective, the Black female presence helped foster significant changes to the penal system of New South Georgia and was the catalyst for early prison reform movements. Economically speaking, African American women prisoners also executed new forms of labor that remained untried in the free labor marketplace, thereby broadening the overall scope of Black women's work in the post-emancipation South. These facts, among others, make it difficult to deny that gender is significant to the study of convict labor in the post-Civil War South. It has become quite clear to me that without the female perspective, it is difficult to fully grasp the complexities of this history. The reality is that incarcerated women experience captivity in uniquely gendered ways. For them, life in a convict lease camp or on a chain gang was in many ways worse than slavery for reasons that extend beyond their decline in material worth after the collapse of slavery or the excessive violence that followed. Unlike their male counterparts, imprisoned women were much more privy to sexual assault, pregnancy, and what I like to call menacing reproduction. The decline in African American women's procreative worth and their also, the decline in African American women's procreative worth also made their laboring bodies susceptible to new forms of reproductive exploitation. All things considered, it is my firm belief that it is the inclusion of women in the historical discourse that best complicates the static notion that convict leasing was nothing more than slavery by another name. Sorry, I'm glad he's not here. While it is true that convict labor systems replicated the cycles of violence, brutality, exploitation, and bodily commodification found in plantation slavery, it is through the female lens that we are best able to identify the dramatic shift from conception to conviction as a means of growing bound labor forces in the New South. The female perspective allows us to more visibly see the ways in which black female maternity was reviled in a way that it hadn't been before emancipation. Whereas in the Old South slavocracy, reproduction was the linchpin for slaveholders' financial success, the New South fiscal model saw pregnancy and childbirth as threats to economic progress and productivity. It is these types of subtle variances between slavery and convict labor that reveal the rich gendered nuances that underlie the female experience of captivity. But African American women's unique experiences of involuntary servitude in the post-bellum South does not stop there, but is also reflected in their laboring practices, gendered experiences of violence, and resistance techniques. As it pertains to labor, it is only when we look at the less familiar narratives of the imprisoned female labor force that we gain a complete picture of the occupational responsibilities held by Southern black women whose work has been widely understood in binary terms. Most scholars have contended that during the post-emancipation era, the rigorous limitations placed on black women's work forced them into two professional categories, domestic and agricultural work or field labor. Yet within the convict lease and chain gang systems of Georgia, African American women's working roles were much more varied, and gender conventions were routinely disregarded due to the vast array of industries that precipitated the indiscriminate use of male and female felons. Paradoxically, the mutability of Georgia's carceral structure expanded the possibilities of black women's labor in the New South, while simultaneously immobilizing female detainees. The barriers that had impeded ex-bond women and their daughters from moving beyond the fields in domestic service were actually unsuitable to Georgia's penal enterprises. Hence, I've come to conclude that African American women's presence within the state's industrially driven convict lease and chain gang systems helped modernize the postbellum South by creating a new and dynamic set of occupational burdens and competencies for black women that remained untested in the free labor market. I've also determined that by way of their hybridized agro-industrial laboring identity, which contrasted with the mono-industrial design of imprisoned men's work, black female convicts helped foster a contemporary balance between the Old South agrarian model and the New South industrial infrastructure. Black male and female felons worked individually and collectively grading surfaces for railroads, laying tracks, mining clay, firing bricks, digging ditches, chopping down trees, harvesting turpentine, plowing fields, and picking crops. In like manner, misdemeanant women, chain gang women, forcibly expanded the vision of New South modernization by building roads and engaging in various public works projects. It is worth noting, however, that both classes of female inmates, felony and misdemeanant, had the double burden of performing hard manual labor and male-oriented skilled trades alongside domestic work. The precarious work arrangements that evolved in Georgia's post-war prison camps were a partial derivative of the Old South plantation regime. In the antebellum period, planters established a promiscuous pattern of utilizing female slaves in masculine modes of field labor. The most, quote, athletic members of the female sex were sometimes forced to dig ditches, cut trees, and haul lumber. Although the convict leasing paradigm embodied some tenuous aspects of plantation slavery, including the ungendering of bond women's labor to satisfy fluctuating pecuniary and work-related needs, Lessees decisively prioritized heavy manual work as the status quo and not the exception. Furthermore, unlike slavery, the obligatory demands placed on black female convicts to enact men's work also included the perpetration of male-oriented skilled labor, including blacksmithing and gristmill operating. We'll talk about that later. In short, the convict lease system disrupted antebellum labor practices and ushered in a new definition of African American women's work. Now, although you don't see women pictured here, Georgia's railroad system was the first industry to experiment with the use of black female prison labor. Less than 1 year after assuming sole proprietorship over Georgia's felons, the Atlanta-based contracting firm of Grant, Alexander and Company had in its possession 17 female convicts, all of whom were former slaves. Born into bondage, Mary Brooks enjoyed 3 years of freedom before she was restored to a lifetime of involuntary servitude. In March 1868, at the tender age of 16, she was convicted of murder by a Bartow County judge and sentenced to, quote, natural life in the walls of the state penitentiary. 1 year later, Brooks and 12 other female inmates traded in their sewing machines, cooking utensils, and wash tubs for pickaxes, carts, and shovels. By 1874, roughly 32 women had been farmed out to the Macon and Augusta, Brunswick, and Albany and Airline Railroads. Railroad construction, even in its crudest form, required a complicated level of technical and organizational skill. Work squads were separated into several divisions and given specific tasks to fulfill in a precise order. First, grading crews leveled the grade with shovels and pickaxes to prepare the ground for tie layers. Cart drivers moved the drift from the cuts to the fields, which consisted of large rock heaps. Tie hacks cut trees and shaped them by hand, then passed them off to tie layers, who hand carried the wooden railroad ties and hammers to the work site. Behind the tie layers came rust eaters, who installed the massive rails. 4 strapping laborers lugged 1 rail at a time until they reached the graded runway. Once the heavy steel was positioned on the gravel bed, a team of spike drivers commenced to hammer large iron spears into the rails to secure the ties. In the railroad camps operated by William Grant and Thomas Alexander, female convicts did the same kind of work as men did in the cuts, where they graded surfaces for railroads, drove carts, and shoveled dirt. In the absence of modern technology, the work had to be done in a time-consuming process that required great strength and dexterity that many women did not have. Graders milled miles of terrain, while cart drivers helped load large pieces of rock and debris in a wheelbarrow, then rolled it up the dirt rock heap of the cuts. The tough grind of railroad construction lasted from sunup to sundown, leaving female prisoners desperately exhausted and unable to churn out more labor. Weak women workers were sometimes flogged and hit with rocks that would, quote, knock them speechless as a means of stimulating greater productivity in the workplace. In Georgia, as was the case in most southern states, women prisoners were seldom required to mine coal. In the New South capital, this was one area in which gender conventions were upheld and female convict labor was divided into gender-specific categories. However, one example of a female miner does in fact manifest in the historical record. In the spring of 1874, George D. Harris was granted a modest lease of prisoners to produce iron ore for Bartow Iron Works in Bartow County, Georgia. The rising entrepreneur paid $20 apiece for his 50-person labor force. His roundup included 49 hale and hearty men and 1 young woman, Sarah Autry. On April 20th, 1871, Autry was convicted of murder by a Lumpkin County judge and sentenced to life imprisonment. At 16 years old, she was handed over to the Grant and Alexander firm to labor on the Airline Railroad. There, she was joined by 100 men and 15 women. In the Flying Railroad camp, Autry was in the company of other women who fought, cried, laughed, and collectively salvaged what was left of their blighted lives. But at George Harris's Bartow Iron Works, she found herself shipwrecked in a sea of men. In the southern Appalachian coal mines, convicts refined primitive technologies and improvised a methodical system of mining that could, by contemporary standards, equate with professional engineering. In the absence of bulldozers, drills, trucks, and modern explosives, convict coal miners used picks, axes, and shovels to dig tunnels. Miners were lowered down the shaft of hand-dug burrows in a metal cage. Prison work gangs labored from dawn until dusk, driving their picks and shovels into the walls of the mine, breaking away chunks of coal and iron ore. In the subterranean hold of the prison mine, convicts tackled the hot, dusty, and wet conditions. Steam pumps worked overtime drawing water out of the mines while furnaces ventilated the shaft, and injury and death were all too common. When George Harris's lease was suspended on May 10, 1875, following claims that he ineffectively managed the state's prisoners, Sarah Autry and her male co-laborers were released to John Howard at 3 times the rate paid by Harris. Howard paid $60 per capita to rent 41 healthy convicts, Autry included, to cut turnpike roads and make brick. But his, quote, utter incompetency to control convict labor cost him the contract. Within 6 months of placing ownership on Harris's defunct charter, Howard was pressured to turn over his labor force. The convicts were immediately traded to another man, A. Smith Barnwell of McIntosh County, and displaced more than 400 miles from Bartow. The prisoner's journey finally ceased in Champney Island in the Altamaha River. At the Camp Herdmont prison plantation in Elbert County, Georgia, which was the first centralized female prison camp in the state, William Henry Maddox, the leasee and former slaveholder, employed a 3-tiered approach to convict leasing: industrial, agricultural, and domestic in nature. Women prisoners plowed fields, sowed crops, paddled through rivers of cotton, felled trees, sawed lumber, ran grist mills, ginned cotton, forged iron, cooked meals, cleaned camp quarters, and washed soiled garments. Eliza Randall, a convicted, quote-unquote, murderess, was the, quote, chief engineer at the camp, put in charge of running the grist mill and doing half of the blacksmithing for the farm. Over a dozen other women were forced to serve as lumberjacks and to assemble a small-scale lumber mill for commercial and domestic purposes. According to historian William Jones, between 1870 and 1910, lumber grew faster than any other industry in the American South and employed more laborers than any other enterprise in the region. African-American men, convict and free, comprised the majority of the Southern lumber workforce and played a key role in the industrial transformation of the Southern states. Yet Black women prisoners also contributed to the thriving timber industry of the New South. Each morning when the big bell rang, the women of Camp Herdmont hurriedly put on their zebra-striped dresses and scuttled out the door of the mess room for a quick breakfast of fried meat, biscuits, and syrup, and that was a good day. After they guzzled down their rations, the workers were lined up in pairs and led to their posts. The plow gang hustled to the stable, about a half a mile away, to gather their mules. Next, they trooped into the fields, with one guard in front and the other at the rear, while a group of sowers and hoers moved in the opposite direction, quote, followed by a guard carrying a pistol in his hip pocket. In the distance, a team of logger women could be seen trailing a camp guard into the dense pine forest. Lumberjacking was an extremely dangerous and unsparing occupation, ordinarily restricted to strong, practiced men. Inexpert at the trade and in many ways lacking the physical power to fell the trees or maneuver their limp corpses, female convicts were often severely wounded. Some were crushed by fallen logs, while others were dismembered by misdirected axe blades or grieved by the pain of dislocated bones and muscle tears. Rose Henderson understood firsthand the dangers of, the dangers lurking in the pine forest. On March 19, 1896, the lumber woman was, quote, hurt by a falling tree and laid up in the camp hospital for 6 days before being driven back into the forest. In a similar instance, 44-year-old Sarah Johnson was nearly crushed to death by a falling tree. Standing at 5 feet 2 inches tall, weighing 165 pounds, the short axe handler was no match for the wooden giant. After the accident, she spent close to 1 month convalescing in the camp infirmary. As if the unremitting slog of hard labor in the state's camps was not unbearable enough, Black female prisoners were routinely tormented by violence. Some inmates were flogged in public acts of humiliation and terror, while others were crammed into wooden solitary confinement chambers, which you see here, which varied little from sweat boxes used to punish the enslaved. But brazen physical violence was only one part of a twofold assault on Black women's humanity. Female convicts were inordinately susceptible to shameless attacks on their sexuality. The whip, a weapon of terror first deployed against the enslaved, was reintroduced in Southern prison camps after the Civil War. Whipping bosses, as they were called, were hired by private lessees with permission from the state to enforce discipline among convicts and to energize fatigued workers. Any prisoner that slacked in her labor duties, or his labor duties, squabbled with other inmates, physically or verbally challenged camp authorities, or dared test the bounds of white supremacy, were, quote, whipped with rawhide. Some bosses went one step further by combining flogging with a practice known as bucking. a carryover from antebellum days where a victim was stripped and forced to lay bound across a log upon which a whipping would be carried out. As the processes of brutality became more advanced, some opted for the use of the bucking machine, a high-tech substitute for the antebellum style of bucking across a log. These carefully staged rituals were oftentimes performed in the presence of other inmates for the express purpose of showing off the rude power of the law. Although rarely documented, male convicts were sometimes forced to assist in acts of violence against female prisoners. These beatings were public performances staged in the presence of other inmates, male and female, to humiliate, demoralize, and terrorize abused victims and frightened onlookers. Certain whipping bosses relied on the tool of what I call communal violence to instigate feelings of intra-racial and intergender discord and suspicion among black detainees and to emasculate and disempower African American men. Although the effectiveness of this disciplinary strategy is uneasily verified, the initiative behind the action gives a sense of the ways in which violence was used to oppress black detainees, whether they were on the receiving end or not. As a rule, African American women in the post-emancipation South were disentitled to the protections afforded to white women. Hence, the heightened devaluation of free black womanhood, the overall societal exclusion of Southern black women from the cult of true womanhood, together with the withdrawn incentive to preserve black life after slavery and the new presence of a highly regenerative penal system that legally sanctioned violence, helped foster brutality. As one former leasee explained, before the war, we owned the Negroes, quote, but these convicts, we don't own them. One dies, get another, hence the title of Matthew Mancini's book, One Dies, Get Another. This one dies, get another economic principle engendered and encouraged unabated forms of violence to persevere in the South's convict lease and chain gang camps. While it is important to account for the inexorable violence that circumscribed African American women's lived and laboring experiences in Georgia's postbellum prison camps, it is equally necessary to analyze the uniquely gendered ways in which women prisoners experience violence. Like the whip, rape became a potent weapon used to terrorize, punish, torture, and exact power over female subjects. Unfortunately, antebellum notions about the unrapeability of black women were superimposed onto the postbellum social and legal landscape, allowing white men to sexually terrorize African American women prisoners unchecked by the law. Alongside power, enduring notions of black female licentiousness and immorality encouraged a continuation of sexual abuse. During the period of slavery, a mythology of black female sexuality was contrived that equated the enslaved woman's body with promiscuity. Antebellum Southerners advanced the notion that female slaves were, quote, lewd and lascivious, and a refusal to yield during a sexual attack was considered, quote, mere feigning. Hence, prison camp authorities took liberties with female inmates based on these same long-standing sexualized assumptions. Beyond the overt act of rape, floggings also bordered on the sexual, as is reflected in the practice of forcefully stripping female captives. But even the physical posturing of male assailants during these attacks was also sexualized in nature. In one Georgia railroad camp, a female prisoner was, quote, whipped with her clothes pulled over her head with the overseer standing on them with her head between his knees, and he was whipping her on her naked butt, end quote. The physical and sexual violence imposed upon imprisoned black women left indelible somatic, psychological, and emotional injuries. Their bodies were wounded through the transgressions of others, but they bore the brunt of the assaults meted out against them. In my study, I actually put forth an attempt to narrate the survivor's pain and to explore the physical and psychological dimensions of abuse on the incarcerated black female body. Undergirding this intellectual decision is historian Deborah Gray White's charge to pursue with rigor the violence levied against black women as a way to decenter lynching as the principal site and foremost expression of white sexual anxiety on the black body. The imprisoned black female body was a living, breathing montage of African American women's suffering. It was decorated with cuts, scratches, broken bones, bruises, and lacerations left by the whip. The type and placement of one's scars told a sad and harrowing story. Bruises and scratches on the abdomen, torso, and lower body likely reflected one's attempt to maybe fight off a sexual attack. Lash marks scored into the delicate skin of a woman's back are demonstrative of the fury with which whipping bosses express their superlative authority over, quote, unruly, quote, lazy, or disobedient subjects. Cuts and broken bones are another indicator of the brutal violence used to extricate the maximum labor possible and to terrorize female victims into submission. The lasting effects of unchecked physical violence were multifarious. Some women were permanently maimed while others died from their injuries. In January 1904, a 14-year-old girl was sentenced to the Bibb County chain gang in central Georgia near Macon for larceny. 6 months after her confinement, the adolescent was sent home to die. As stated by social reformer Clarissa Oates Keeler, quote, the scars on the girl's body corroborated her dying testimony that she had been whipped to death. The verdict of the coroner's jury was, quote, her death was the result of cruel treatment. Like physical scars, emotional injuries caused by rape left a permanent imprint on the mind and spirit of female victims. Rape survivors were almost certainly afflicted by a multitude of psychosomatic challenges that can be best understood in modern terms. While one must be cautious not to project 21st century knowledge onto a late 19th and early 20th century historical situation, contemporary research does provide new ways of understanding the psychological impact of sexual violence on female victims. Because of the lack of available historical evidence, the only way to attempt to account for the ways in which rape affected Southern African American women prisoners is to use present-day scientific research. Not unlike most rape victims, imprisoned women likely suffer from anxiety, depression, withdrawal, insomnia, flashbacks, nightmares, low self-esteem, and a host of other medical problems. In extreme cases, some sufferers may have experienced long-term sexual disorders, such as hypoactive sexual desire disorder, which is actually a chronic lack of interest in sexual activity, or sexual aversion disorder, which is a phobic avoidance of sexual contact with an intimate partner. It was not unheard of for formerly enslaved women who were raped by their masters or forced to couple or breed with other slaves to put off marriage or to abstain from sexual relations with the opposite sex for the remainder of their lives. The same may also be true of formerly incarcerated women, although there are no autobiographical accounts or oral testimonies that exist to support this assertion. Beyond the issues cited above, the pain of sexual violence likely engendered other somatic and psychological responses. It is possible that some victims turned their suffering inward, shielding the extent of their anguish from public view and choosing not to share their inner feelings with the outside world. These women may have employed the art of dissemblance, a term used by historian Darlene Clark Hine to describe the manner in which some black women adapted their behavior and attitudes to create an appearance of transparency and disclosure while actually shielding the truth of their inner lives from their oppressors as a coping mechanism. Some may have also experienced denial or purposely blocked out the traumatizing episodes in an effort to retain soundness of mind, which would have been paramount to one's ability to survive her remaining years or months in bondage. Others probably found relief by doing just the opposite. For some, sharing the details of a painful event, to a trusted party and gaining emotional support from another victim of sexual violence could have functioned as a powerful mode of therapy. Unfortunately, we may never know the full extent to which African American women coped with their post-assault suffering. Yet, in spite of the rough assaults on their bodies, pride, and personhood, incarcerated women forged a unique culture of dissent in response to the power structure of the modern penal system, and like other subordinate groups, made use of private and public techniques of subversion. Bondwomen malingered, disobeyed orders, set fires, ran away, fought camp guards, cursed their superiors, and destroyed property. Each act of resistance administered by a female captive, whether large or small, individual or collective, was a hopeful gesture toward preserving her self-worth in an inhumane system built on terror and control. The methods of resistance beseeched by women prisoners are quite similar to the strategies utilized by female slaves. For some black female captives in the post-emancipation South, malingering was a proficient tool of opposition. The act of working slowly, sloppily, or avoiding work altogether was done in an attempt to undercut the leasee's earnings and to undermine the profitability of the carceral state. Moreover, African American women prisoners sidestepped their duties as a conscious rejection of their rented chattel status. Case in point, in Jefferson County, Georgia, Mary Puckett, a convicted arsonist, life-term felon, and former slave, was put in charge of plowing the fields of the Old Town Plantation. She had the capability to raise her through the fields with the adroitness of a man and to command her mule like a drill sergeant, but instead, she opted to play clumsy and shirk her duties. As a consequence, she was flogged multiple times for, quote, bad plowing and, quote, neglect of work. In a similar instance, 22-year-old Laura Johnson, a convicted burglaress, was flogged 3 times in less than 1 month for, quote, failure to work. While most female convicts used acts of day-to-day resistance in their attempts to thwart the state-sponsored attack on their self-worth, others made more dramatic displays of their discontent. They ran away. Some absconded in hopes of securing freedom from overwork. Others fled physical and or sexual abuse and tyranny. Women like Maddie Crawford, who you see pictured here, on the other hand, used both public and private acts of resistance to help sustain themselves in their journey through unfreedom's wild territory. In 1896, Maddie Crawford of Meriwether County, Georgia, was convicted of murdering her stepfather, who allegedly abused her and she, quote, brained him with a chair. Although by this time, all of the state's female felons resided in the hands of William Henry Maddox at the Camp Hermon prison farm, which I showed a sketch earlier for women. Crawford's large size and muscular build encouraged officials to reorder her route to the Chattahoochee Brickyard. According to one source, quote, after being there a while, her great strength and activity caused those in charge of her to plan heavy work for her. She expressed a desire to become a blacksmith and she was taught the trade. In my view, Crawford's choice, if what is said to be true, if what is said is true, that she wanted to learn to be a blacksmith, if what is said to be true, Crawford's choice to learn the ironsmith trade, in my opinion, was not a conscious disavowal of her womanhood. On the contrary, I believe she valued her femininity and put up a fight to preserve it. It is important to mention that Crawford began her blacksmithing apprenticeship wearing skirts, but, quote, with her skirts being in the way, the guards forced her to put on the trousers. Several whippings were necessary to make her consent to this. Unable to physically resist her captors' attempts to defeminize her, Crawford resorted to the use of a different resistance technique. She performed masculinity and took advantage of the perks afforded her. Yet within, she may have secretly affirmed her womanhood, using her proficiency as an ironsmith as a measurement of her own feminine identity. In prison for a lifetime, Crawford also opted to use her skills to temporarily liberate herself from the physical and symbolic constraints of prison life. She actually was afforded more mobility as a blacksmith. She was able to do blacksmith throughout the town of Milledgeville and blacksmithing work throughout the town of Milledgeville to escape the plantation. Just the same, by embracing masculine garb and practicing male-oriented labor, she contested the imposed heterosexual violence levied against the black female body. While male clothing certainly did not make an African-American woman immune to sexual assault, it is still quite possible that Crawford used her dress and vocation as a blacksmith to redirect the gaze of her captors and to refashion the way in which her body was framed by her keepers and the system as a whole. For decades, Southern black women prisoners were beset by violence, terror, and unrelenting work demands. But despite their circumstances and setbacks, these women did not surrender their will to survive. Inspired by the grit and power of all of slavery's mothers and freedom's daughters, black female convicts rejected their role as working beasts or sexual bodies and actively engaged in the struggle to preserve their self-identity. Notwithstanding their limited victories, these women clung to a fleeting hope that one day they will be liberated from social, economic, political, and gender oppression and have their humanity recognized and affirmed. In view of the challenges and trials imprisoned black women fared, my book Chained in Silence represents my attempt to give voice to a group of women that had theirs taken away. But creating voice was much more difficult than I expected. In order to tell these women's stories, I had to continuously rely on others' interpretations of events and read between illegible lines to locate sound in silence. I would also have to grapple with the fact that certain aspects of these women's lives will remain forever obscured. This was a haunting reality. I began to question, is it feasible to push through the silence in order to reclaim these women's lived experiences? Can I accept the fact that there are so many aspects of this story that are incapable of being known or understood? After much pondering, I came to conclude that I did not have a choice in the matter and that I could not allow myself to remain at the mercy of the meta-narrative. I had to honor the unknowable and move forward. Understanding that it is impossible for one book to completely break the chains of silence that have circumscribed Black women's historical and historiographical realities for decades, I hope future discourses like those being forged by UCLA's finest, Professor Sarah Haley, seated here to my right and your left, who I'm throwing on the spot, who's doing some ridiculous, amazing work of her own, will continue to come forth. One area of exploration I would like to see expounded on in the future is the post-carceral experience and the ways in which African American women's lives were shaped in the aftermath of imprisonment. It will be useful to know how people's social and economic lives were affected upon their release. Did women return to the counties of their birth? Were they socially resurrected upon their return? How were they received by their community, family, and friends? How did ex-prisoners cope with the lingering psychological effects of captivity, terror, and sexualized violence? How did they respond to the limited job prospects waiting for them on the outside? For as much as the post-carceral experience is a crucial element to consider in future analyses, there are other ways the historical narrative can be enriched. The examination of prison culture, as well as African American women's experiences of and contribution to the cultural milieu of the postbellum carceral state, is rarely emphasized in the historical literature, but is an essential and critical category of analysis. And another intervention that Dr. Haley is doing with the Lomax recordings, which I purposely did not include in my book because I think that she could do a much more vicious and amazing treatment of them. So on a final note, as scholars carve out new roads of understanding, I think it is important to remember the temporal implications of this history. Unfortunately, today, Black women are still afflicted by the social, political, and economic vices that predisposed them to arrest, conviction, and incarceration in the past. Hence, in order to better understand the modern carceral state and the complex relationship Black women have with it, we must confront the past and use the post-Civil War South, where the majority of the nation's Black female incarcerees were once imprisoned, as an essential historical reference point. Thank you very much.